Host this event for our community. In case some of you are not familiar with the Friends of Two Rivers, part of our mission statement has always been to seek out and deliver accurate information to the community. With that intent, I'd like to welcome the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Lands. Pardon me, I'm trying to read my own handwriting here. And thank the Missoula County Rural Initiatives Office for helping coordinate these presentations to the community to kind of bring everybody up to speed as to what's going on. This project is named the Montana Legacy Project, and that's about all I know about it. That's why I'm here to learn tonight too. So now I'd like to turn this over to Pat O'Haron and get you on to some informed people.
That would not be me. I'll pass it on. Missoula County Commissioners were approached by the Nature Conservancy and the Trust for Public Lands several months ago when this project first broke. And it's been something that's been discussed between TNC, TPL, and Plum Creek for quite some time now, and these two entities will give you some information on that, as well as what the project actually entails now. The concern the county commissioners had was that this will greatly influence how Missoula County will develop in the coming years. Plum Creek Timber, Inc. owns a little over 400,000 acres of land in Missoula County alone. And of that, they are selling to TNC and TPL roughly 220,000 acres. And so that's a significant change in lands that are currently private, that may be private in the future. They may be Forest Service, they may be state, and that's what we're here to learn about tonight. The commissioners were quite enthusiastic about this project, in part because of the partners that have put it together, but also because it gives an opportunity for Missoula County residents to learn about private lands and how those lands will be developed or not in the future. And that development could be development to keep land in the timber base. It could be development to keep public access open to those lands. It could be development of the type that we usually associate with development, housing, commercial areas, that sort of thing. And what better way to get the public involved in that discussion than to have meetings like this in our communities outside the Missoula area. So again, thank you for coming tonight. The information that you'll hear tonight will be on the Missoula County Rural Initiatives website. We will work with MCAT to get the video from tonight on the website also. Marcia Hogan, who is our facilitator, will create a set of notes. Those will be posted on the website also. So you can follow up in those ways as well, as the fact that if you signed in tonight, you will notice there's a contact list. And TPL and TNC are making sure that folks who attend these meetings stay up to date, and they actually have routine mailings to people who sign up. So you'll have the ability to stay involved as this project evolves. Having said that, the commissioners want to make sure that you understand, from our perspective, this is a multi-year process. This isn't just one meeting in each rural community, get some comments, and then we all go home. This is something that will take some time to develop, and keeping citizens involved and getting your input on what you want to see happen to these lands is crucial to keeping our communities viable, whether it's Bonner or Frenchtown or Condon or Lolo or Evero or Clinton or any of those places. So again, thank you for coming. Please stay involved, and I'll turn it over to Marcia.
All right, great. Well, my most important job tonight is to make sure you all get cookies. They're all back here. So if you want coffee, please feel free to get up and help yourself. Otherwise, I feel like otherwise I'm going to eat all the cookies. You can just pass those around. My other job tonight is really to make sure we move through this in an efficient way and you get out of here by 9 o'clock. And we have really two main objectives tonight. And one of them is, as Pat said, it's for you to have this opportunity to learn about this unique undertaking, the Montana Legacy Project, which you've probably already read some about. But we have two people who are going to talk about it in two pretty short presentations, probably last 20 minutes. And then we'll take questions, have a question-answer session. And probably spend our first hour doing that, and then the second hour or less, we're going to spend some time getting some feedback from you, because you all know this area, and there may be some things you can share with the Trust for Public Lands or the Nature Conservancy about your knowledge. And you may have some other things you want them to be aware of from your perspective. So, for starters, I just ask everyone listen attentively and try and avoid side conversations or turn your cell phone off, and that'll just make it easier for all. So I don't know which one of you is Chris Bryant, and he is with the Nature Conservancy, and this is Robert Rasmussen, who's with the Trust for Public Lands, and they're each going to talk about two different aspects of the project. You have your own mic, right?
I do, yeah.
Okay. I should also say, we have MCAT, which some of you probably watch, and they're filming this tonight, so that's why we have the mics.
Great, well, since it's a small group, I think I'll just sit down and talk to you. My name is Chris Bryant. I started with the Nature Conservancy at the beginning of this Montana Legacy Project, and came on board to work on community outreach. And so we've been doing these meetings since around July. And one thing I want to just stress is that, as Pat said, this is going to be a multi-year project. And so, and we really want to talk to as many community members as we can. And so if you all know different entities in this area that we should go out and talk to, I'd really encourage you to get them in touch with me so we can come out and have further meetings. And also, towards the end of this meeting, I think we'll figure out what the best way to keep this group engaged and informed will be. So thanks again for coming out. We're competing tonight with the presidential debates. So that must be why we have a small crowd. But
Hopefully you and Robert are engaged in this.
we could get after each other.
Yeah.
We need a table here.
A little bit of background on I guess both of our organizations and the work that we've been doing in this area, and which is really kind of where this project came from, I think. The Nature Conservancy has been working in this area, especially in the Blackfoot watershed, for quite some time, and about 5 years ago I embarked with the Blackfoot Challenge on something called the Blackfoot Community Project. We purchased 88,000 acres of Plum Creek land in that project, which is different in many aspects to this project, but the goals, I think, were much the same. And the Trust for Public Land has been working up in the Swan for a long time, working with those communities and purchasing Plum Creek land and other lands and putting conservation easements on that ground. And as time has gone on, it was very clear that even the 88,000 acre project wasn't really big enough. A lot of people came to our organizations and were asking to embark on a project of a larger scale, and neither of our organizations could do this alone, and so we decided to work together. The result of that is this Montana Legacy Project. This is a 300 and roughly 13,000 acres of Plum Creek land that the Trust for Public Land and the Nature Conservancy have entered a purchase and sale agreement with Plum Creek Timber to buy for roughly $510 million. The goals of the project are much the same, as I mentioned, as the goals that came out of the work we've been doing here for a long time. We want to conserve the natural resource values of this land. These are immensely valuable lands in terms of wildlife and fisheries resources and natural resources for both migrating animals, for year-round resident animals. And for fisheries, we want to retain those characteristics. They're incredibly valuable to all of us, I think. We can all agree on that. The other is public access for generations. These industrial timberlands have been kind of de facto public land in the sense of people being able to go out and hunt and fish and snowmobile and other forms of recreation on these lands. And that can rapidly change if you have a one large landowner all of a sudden turns into many smaller landowners. And that is exactly the outcome that we're trying to avoid. And the third goal of the project is to keep these lands in a working landscape. They've been timberland for a very long time, and many of the lands, especially in some of the areas, have been grazed for a long time too. And those characteristics, that connection to the land, really, who knows what that's going to look like into the future, but the potential to keep that going is very important, I think, to Western Montana. And so those are the goals that we're trying to achieve with this project. I think Robert is going to talk a little bit about the particulars of the funding side of the project, and also the potential disposition of the lands, and then we can get into questions.
Thanks, Chris. Again, my name's Robert Rasmussen. I work with the Trust for Public Land. I live and work over in Helena. We have our principal office down in Bozeman, but I work out of Helena. And I've been working in the Swan Valley for 10 years since we've been working in Swan for 10 years. I've been working there 7 years since I started with the Trust for Public Land. I also had the opportunity to work on the tail end of the Thompson Fisher Conservation Easement Project, which was also a transaction with Plum Creek and Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks that placed an easement on 140,000 acres over in western Montana. And that's received pretty good support over time. It was certainly some hurdles in the initial part of that, but the outcomes people seem to be very happy with, local commissioners, sporting organizations and individuals, and I just heard a little bit about that last week again. So we think that we're providing some meaningful response to land ownership, land management issues here in the state. As Chris mentioned, these red lands constitute about 313,000 acres that we have an agreement to acquire. That acquisition will take place over a 3-year period beginning this December, and there'll be a phase, 2 additional phases each December thereafter. So 2008, 2009, 2010, we'll have an acquisition of a percentage of this footprint in each of those months. Up here, we originally looked at including some about 14,000 acres up in northwest Montana, up by Libby, and that has been taken off the table right now, and we do retain an option to purchase that land in the future. That option is good for about 2 years, but it is not part of our formalized acquisition that we're going to be discussing and moving forward with right away. How do we pull this off? $510 million. We're going to be looking at a combination of federal, state, and private funding to accomplish this. Initially, the Trust for Public Land and Nature Conservancy have committed to completing this project, so we will do what it takes in terms of private sector financing, whether it's borrowing, getting grants, etc., from private philanthropy, but we will be utilizing those mechanisms in large part to jumpstart this project and get us through our first closing. In terms of ultimate outcomes, however, federal funding, the 2008 Farm Bill, there was a provision included in that was championed by Senator Baucus. That included a provision that will allow nonprofit organizations such as ours to apply for funding through a couple of mechanisms, but one of them basically will allow us to apply for about $250 million worth of federal funding. That comes with a big catch, though. That's not just free money. In turn, if we utilize that, if we're successful in achieving that through our application process, we are bound by certain aspects of that legislation to convey these properties to the Forest Service. So we will be conveying, if we're successful in that $250 million request, we will end up having to convey that equal amount of value in lands to the Forest Service. When we look at the footprint here, there are some very obvious places where a Forest Service acquisition would be logical in terms of long-term land ownership and management, and also areas that meet all the various criteria of that funding provision. It has to be within a forest boundary, adjacent to Forest Service land, has to be under what's called a habitat conservation plan, which Plum Creek does have over many of its lands. So in doing that, we looked at basically the Swan Valley checkerboard, the upper Lolo drainage checkerboard, and some of this checkerboard in here with Forest Service on the Lolo National Forest. And those are what appear to us to be logical places to apply that funding if we're successful. Another element of public funding is through the state of Montana. There obviously, and there's some places in the Swan River State Forest where we've got state lands checkerboarded with Plum Creek lands. That's an obvious place where it makes sense for the state to block up some of their ownership. In speaking with their, I don't know exact title, but their forest manager of the Swan River State Forest, he indicates that if they were able to manage those lands on a watershed basis instead of a every square mile basis, they would actually be able to provide a road network for forest management that is more efficient, cost efficient to construct, less environmentally damaging, and providing for access to more timberlands in terms of forest land management. So, it makes a lot of sense then to look at trying to block up that state ownership there. A couple other areas where state ownership exists is in the Fish Creek drainage, and of course in some checkerboard over here in what we call the Potomac block, there is already some state ownership. Further decisions about what might be conveyed to the state remain to be worked through, but certainly an obvious one is that checkerboard area in the Swan River State Forest. Where does that state funding come from? We're looking at a variety of sources. The Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, the DNRC, that manages school state trust lands, including the Swan River State Forest, has what the legislature has authorized, a land banking program, whereby they can sell lands that don't have a lot of public value and don't generate a lot of revenue for schools, sell those out and take that funding and apply it to lands that have greater public value and greater benefit in terms of revenue for support of the school systems. So there is some funding available through that existing source that we'll be looking at. There's also funding through the legislative process, and we'll be working through legislators and the governor's office in terms of trying to, and as well as the agencies, the state agencies, DNRC, and also Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, in terms of trying to develop a package that would be further the implementation of this project and further state ownership of some of these lands. And that's something that we've heard in a number of our community meetings like this. People believe that state ownership is a logical outcome. They also recognize that there are limitations in terms of the state funding capacity to achieve that, but we'll be working with all those agencies and legislators in the governor's office to try to figure out what a logical package is there. A couple other funding sources that are actually federal funding sources, but they go through the state of Montana, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Agency. One of them is called the Habitat Conservation Plan funding. That basically addresses endangered species. And one of the state's highest priority for that is in this area right here, in what's called the Marshall Block up by Seeley Lake. So that's an area, an application has been submitted already, jointly between TNC, TPL, and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, to request funding for acquisitions and/or conservation easements in this area to protect the fisheries values and enhance the fisheries values in those areas. Similarly, in the Swan Valley, the state is also the potential recipient. The Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Agency is the potential recipient for funding for fisheries mitigation again, but this is through the Bonneville Power Administration. And it can only be applied in the Swan Valley. It's the only part of the Columbia River watershed that is part of our project area, and that is subject to the mitigation obligations that BPA has for construction of Hungry Horse Dam. So that funding would be applied to high priority fisheries streams in the Swan Valley, and again, likely, since it's Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Agency, likely applied to some of the high-value fishery reaches in the Swan River State Forest, and working with DNRC in terms of long-term management on those issues. And then the private sector, I mentioned, we're looking at significant funding or underwriting by the private philanthropy community, whether that's foundations or major donors or a number of small donors, and our teams are working diligently on that aspect. And there also may be other private outcomes in terms of another timber management organization. We are in contact and have had some dialogue and will continue to have dialogue with entities that also have interests in managing lands as timberlands, but not subdividing them for recreational or other development. Conveyances to other private parties will likely involve placement of a conservation easement on those lands to make sure that our project objectives that Chris outlined are maintained through that conveyance. Also, as Chris may have mentioned, TPL and TNC don't anticipate holding these lands in perpetuity. Our objective is to convey them in some sort of conservation outcome to public and private entities. We recognize that we may be a landowner for a while. We may be a landowner for a short time on some lands. We may be a landowner for 10 years on other lands, but we don't intend to hold them forever. One of the factors that goes into that is what is part of our agreement includes a fiber supply agreement with Plum Creek. We're obligated to provide to Plum Creek 92 million board feet of timber from somewhere on these lands over the next 10 years. It's not a huge commitment, but it's an important commitment in terms of Plum Creek's reliance upon these lands for production of timber to their mills. Also, it's important in terms of the fact that some of these lands have already been harvested, and the amount of merchantable timber is limited, so we have to be very careful about where further harvests occur and how they occur in terms of maintaining those conservation objectives that we talked about as one of the purposes of our project. So we'll be working with Plum Creek in that regard. Once we acquire any lands from Plum Creek, we are then responsible for the management of those lands, whether it's the timber management to meet the obligations of the fiber supply agreement or other management activities in terms of public recreation, etc. So I mentioned we will acquire lands in 3 phases. Each time we acquire lands from Plum Creek, then we assume those management obligations for the lands that we acquire. We basically intend to maintain the status quo in terms of access conditions and that sort of thing. We will look for opportunities with partner organizations to improve or address some of the environmental issues that might occur on some of these lands, whether it's replacing a culvert or reclaiming a road that is eroding or something of that nature. But we recognize that each one of those activities has a cost to it, and we will be looking for partnerships to help accommodate that. One last thing, when we do harvest timber and get it to Plum Creek's mills, then they will compensate us at the fair market value for that timber at the time of delivery. So we anticipate, and it's very hard to predict the timber economy right now, but any revenue that is generated from that source, we anticipate basically going into our land management activities. We don't anticipate there'll be excess revenue that can be taken and applied to our capital investment for the acquisition, but basically it's for the operation for our land management activities during our ownership. With that, I think I've covered everything I wanted to in terms of intro.
Okay. I think a couple people came in after we started up, and just so you know, we're going to take question and answers for maybe another half hour, and then we'll spend some time getting your thoughts on what you think about this project and some things you may want to tell them about the areas that are in your neighborhood that you know about. So I have this mic, and since we're being filmed, I'm going to give this to the person who wants to ask the first question.
Well, yeah, and you talked about the two, the state ownership and the federal ownership as being possibilities, and that there may be ideal situations for either in certain kinds of places. And I guess I was curious to know what would be different about state management compared to federal. If you looked at more or less equivalent lands, why would there be any difference as to whether or not the federal government owned them or the state?
Did everyone hear the question? Okay.
The question, just to recap it in case everyone didn't hear it, was Robert mentioned that some lands might be better for state and some for federal, and what would the difference be? How would we choose those? And if you look at this map, there's a pretty obvious checkerboard on this ground over here, and one of the ideas behind this is to block up this land into an ownership that allows one management entity to make decisions on a broader landscape. And so Robert mentioned, for example, the Swan State Forest being a priority for the state. That would allow the state to then be able to manage in a larger block. As the Swan Valley down here with all this Forest Service ownership, or perhaps the Lolo, that would make more sense, obviously, for Forest Service ownership.
But as far as the actual land practices themselves and management practices, there's no particular difference between the two agencies.
So the question is, sort of, how does state and federal management compare?
Yeah, I think different people have different ideas about that. I know some folks who follow public land management issues very closely recognize that there is a distinction between forest management at the federal level, national forests, or DNRC management. Part of it is, as expressed to us anyway, has been concerns about public access. Will roads be closed if they become part of the federal system and subject to all the management guidelines that the feds have to go through? Concern about timber management. Right now, it's been very difficult for the Forest Service to conduct timber harvests. Part of that is because they have to address what's called cumulative effects, as does the state, but the feds more so. And that means taking into account what has happened on adjacent lands. So when you have a checkerboard ownership pattern like this, it creates land management problems associated with that, because what occurs on one block may constrain what may occur on another block. So there are a lot of schools of thought. Some people think it's great to have federal ownership because, you know, it can be managed better, more protections for wildlife and fisheries species, more opportunities for public recreation, and similarly with the state also has an objective in terms of a DNRC school trust land ownership. They have a mandate to generate revenue for the school trusts, and so that is a difference that some people recognize as well, that there is a difference in management objectives there. But our project and the purposes of our project are such that we're going to work very hard to, you know, implement this project, make this acquisition occur, work hard with whomever acquires the lands to try to understand and implement the goals of the project. But once it does go into, say, a public ownership, then its management is going to be subject to the policies of that agency, and as those policies are influenced by the public in terms of forest plans or whatever. So we won't be able to control forever on public acquisitions what the ultimate use and management of lands would be. Private lands, again, our principal objective would be to try to prohibit further subdivision and development and maintain public access opportunities and provide for ongoing forest management. It's a little easier on the private side because some of those objectives can be achieved through conservation easements. And so we'll be working with potential private owners to make sure those objectives are carried forward if the land does remain in a private ownership.
On that same note, the land board recently has been trading ground or selling ground as part of the school trust initiative to raise money for the school trust. Does the conservation easement stick with those lands that the state acquires through this project, or is it turned over to the state entirely?
Well, first of all, there's only a portion of these lands that are subject to conservation easements right now,
Okay,
okay?
so if the state
And those
gets
are
it-
up in the Swan Valley. This area right in here, about 7,200 acres, are subject to Plum Creek lands are currently subject to a conservation easement, and that would stay on the lands. Yes, it would be what we acquire from Plum Creek is what we would convey to another party, including the state in that case.
Okay. I was just wondering, because they have been trading and selling ground, if they find that's the best use for that ground, so I was just wondering how that was going to be handled.
Is there any guarantee, for instance, Plum Creek lands now, people can often walk in, or they can ride in, or snowmobile, or four-wheel, or take their trucks or cars? Any guarantee that that will remain, or is that just a hope that they'll remain open and available?
Well,
I think as Robert mentioned, you know, when these lands go into, say, Forest Service ownership, they will be placed under Forest Service management plans. If they go into the state, they'll be placed under the management guidelines that the state has. You know, there's an opportunity here, I think, we have wildly different road networks on these checkerboards, and I think there's an opportunity to take a new look, but that's really would be, if the Forest Service gets the land, that would be the Forest Service responsibility to manage those lands in the way that they manage them. On private ground, you know, we would want to have access for the public. That may take lots of different forms. I think it really depends on what is there now, and we just have to, as time goes on, I think, figure that out. You know, at least say, walk-in access for hunting and those kind of uses. But it'd be, it's hard to guarantee that any particular road would stay open or not open under our ownership. Like Robert said, our goal is to maintain the status quo. So until then, we would want to keep the kind of same level of access that people enjoy now. You want to add anything, Robert?
And the only thing I would add is that in negotiations with any private party for a disposition to a private entity, that's one of our commitments, is to try to secure that public access in perpetuity through a conservation easement. It's very similar to what we did with the Thompson Fisher conservation easement through Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We basically compensated Plum Creek for public access in perpetuity as well as other rights, but that was included, and that's would be our objective in any other conveyance to a private entity.
In two of these areas, you have endangered species, the grizzly in the Swan area and wolves in the Fish Creek area, and joining up the road systems is not going to be any help to endangered species. And I'm also concerned about the old growth, for instance, in the Swan Valley, which really desperately needs to be protected just for the same values that you've been talking about. The things that are important to us are wildlife species, and the old growth timber are more important to me, and I think some other people, than having connected road systems. I guess that was a statement.
Did you want to comment on?
Yeah, I can comment briefly. Because I've worked in the Swan, I do recognize some of the issues related to the Grizzly Bear Management Agreement and how that affects timber management and other activities within the linkage zones, and which ones are open for timber harvest at which times and that sort of thing. So there's been a real effort to try to identify what the needs of endangered species are and conduct land management activities, particularly because we have state, federal, and Plum Creek ownerships up there, to try to coordinate those to benefit or at least not adversely impact the endangered species that occur and are present in the Swan Valley. So I think one of the things we've said in other public meetings is that we intend to, as an acquiring entity of Plum Creek lands, we intend to honor those agreements during our ownership as well. We will participate in the Grizzly Bear Management Agreement in the Swan. We'll participate in the Habitat Conservation Plan that Plum Creek utilizes for native fish species protections. So, and then we will, pass that along to another entity if we convey the land as well.
Will you have any control over the other entity when you pass it on?
No, because those agreements are, they're assignable in terms of signatories, but I think that each agreement provides opportunity at a certain point in time for any of the agreeing parties to terminate the agreement. They're voluntary agreements, for sure. But it's one way, a successful way, I'd say, of managing these lands in multiple ownerships with endangered species present.
When we start talking, going into the next session and talking about your concerns, we'll capture yours. Okay. Did you have a question over here? Nope. Okay. I thought you raised your hand.
I just wanted to ask you guys, since you're here, I'm kind of loud anyway. Since you're here, and we're here because we live here, and this is our community, can you kind of bring this project home for us a little bit? And give us an idea of what the possibility is for this area that we look at every day, and what some of our concerns, what concerns we might need to be looking for in the future, and what the potential is also. Just bring it home for us a little bit.
Okay. I think that's very, very good. As Pat or Chris mentioned, we have had meetings up in Potomac and up in the Sealy Swan, but we haven't had meetings down, we've had one in Clinton, but we haven't had one right in the heart here. Each of those meetings has provided some information from the local community that we can utilize, whether it's relating to questions about access, which roads are currently open and utilized for recreational purposes that we need to pay attention to make sure that they are retained. Which areas are known by folks in terms of any particular environmental issues, whether it's erosion into streams or things like that that we should know about. Hunting, other areas that are popular for recreation where people want to make sure that they're maintained. And also your input in terms of what do you see as logical ownership patterns. I think with the Forest Service, we've got some pretty definite things that can be pursued there to block up some of that ownership, to provide opportunities for linkages. Not in your country here, basically right through here, looking at possible linkages. We still have the interstate to deal with, but by blocking up ownership, eliminating that possibility for habitat fragmentation, at least in terms of subdivision and development, we have the opportunity to preserve and enhance that corridor for movement of wildlife. But there's some large blocks here, and we're certainly open to people's ideas about what's important about this landscape, and how can we best implement this project to further the public's objectives here too. I don't know if that helps.
Well, I guess this is related to Mary's question too, and that is in those, the two large blocks. This large block and this large block, what's the timber status in those two areas currently? Have they been harvested recently? What's their potential for harvest? Do you guys know that kind of thing right now?
I don't personally. I don't know if Chris does. We do have a person who's working on that, and we're also retaining a silviculturist to assist in terms of identifying those areas that can help us meet the obligation of that fiber supply agreement. But personally, I don't have knowledge of what the stocking is on various parts of this footprint.
This is slightly related, and it's what types of activities do you envision after the sale to sort of get a better idea of what is actually out there? I know that the communities obviously have the best sense of what's there and what's not, but what are your plans in terms of, are you going to be looking for third parties to do assessments that will help you determine sort of where these lands go and what the best solution or outcome or a conveyance is?
When we were before we signed the purchase and sale agreement, we hired a third party to go out and look kind of in a rough way of what was out there, and so we could negotiate with Plum Creek and talk about the amount of timber in the fiber supply agreement that we were comfortable with. The stage that we're at right now is, as Robert said, we're going to be hiring silviculturalists and also contractors to get out and on the ground and really see how we can fulfill that fiber supply agreement, and that's ongoing right now. Besides that, though, there's other opportunities here, I think, for work to be done on the ground. There's all kinds of restoration potential out there. There's other, just the management activities. Steve Kletzel's here, who is the Nature Conservancy land steward in the Blackfoot, and he could talk, I'm sure, about all the kinds of work that he does and the kinds of work that we'll be doing on these lands, and maybe you'd want to do that. I don't know, but yeah. And then the other part of this is that we really welcome and would like community monitoring and community input as we go through this project. We want people out there seeing what we're doing on the ground and commenting on it. So we're very open to that and hopeful for that, for the community to have some ownership in that.
Yeah, I'd be glad to talk a little bit, at least about how things have gone on in the Blackfoot. Of course, we inherited those lands from Plum Creek with a lot of uses on them already. Much as we'll inherit these lands with uses. I'm not working on these legacy project lands yet, and I don't know how much money I'm going to be given to work on them. And it all comes down to money, of course. One of the things that people always talk about is weeds. What are you going to do about the weeds? We all know there's a huge legacy of weeds up there, and that takes an awful lot of money to do, so to treat. So that's one thing that we'll do our best in addressing weeds, whether it be biocontrol, revegetation, or spraying, using contractors to do some of that. But again, it just comes down to money. We'll inherit some grazing leases up there, and we intend to honor those grazing leases and continue to manage them similar to how Plum Creek had managed those. One caveat that we have to say is that we'll continue existing uses provided there's no significant resource damage occurring. That's only logical that a new landowner would want to manage the land in that way. So we'll look at, are there springs that need to be developed or protected? Are there riparian areas that need to be protected? What else do I think about? Roads is probably the number one issue that I deal with up in the Blackfoot, road management and access management. And so one thing that we'll be looking at is, certainly there's an intended road system that was intended to be used on these lands by Plum Creek, and then there's the roads that are being used. And one thing that we've had to do a lot of in the Blackfoot is get back to that intended use. So if there are user-created roads where, hill climbs, gates that are ripped out, those need to be replaced and repaired, and that's something that we'll work towards, because that's the intent, and those gates were put in for a reason. But a lot of that has to be worked out in those areas with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and with the local communities to see what was the, intended uses of those lands and what are the logical uses of those lands. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. Anything I missed?
Well, I think you have a questions. And then we'll, I think, open this up to more discussion. If we're ready.
I'm still a little nervous about private ownership. For instance, what if a business like Paws Up Ranch wants to buy 15 of the sections up in the Potomac area, or if Stimson wants to buy up 20 of the sections? Do you have the ability to say, well, that doesn't really fit with our plan for this project? Because there's potential then that the lands could be blocked and not available for public access. Can you deny a sale? Or if somebody makes an offer, are you obliged to accept the offer?
No, we can, in terms of the private disposition of this, we will be the title holders of the land for a period of time, and we want to make the whatever private disposition might happen fit the goals of our project. So we're not going to go out and sell it to somebody who would then, close off large blocks of this land that wouldn't fulfill the goals of this project in any way. No, the Forest Service will get hopefully $250 million worth of it.
Do you know how much Forest Service country has been closed off in the last 25 years by them people? You can't go anywhere now.
So let's turn that into.
Go to in the 1960s.
Why don't we turn that into, I'm gonna move this into some of the concerns you have. What we're gonna do in this next part is give them feedback about your concerns with this land, particularly in the area where you live. Your concerns about its future disposition, to help them as they figure out what course this is gonna take. And I have two questions. One, this will come to at the end, sort of how this is more about how to keep you all connected in the next couple coming years. But this one is, what do you want the Trust for Public Lands, TPL, and the Nature Conservancy, TNC, to take into consideration as they carry out the Montana Legacy Project. And one of your concerns is what?
Well, like Tim was saying a little bit ago, he's concerned about, the tying up of public access by going into private. But going into public ownership like the Forest Service, they're worse than the private people for closing off public lands. You look at what we had accessible to the public, 20, 30 years ago compared to what we got now, and there's nothing left. Most of the recreational trails and the accesses, granted there is logging into it now, which has been more than what it used to be, but, the original trails and stuff that were recreational trails, the Forest Service has closed off so many of them, there's nothing left in this part of the country to recreate on, and that's why people went to four-wheelers, because they can go anywhere that they feel like going. And you can't shut them out unless you close it off. But the old original recreational trails and the hunting trails and the old fire trails and stuff are all gone. Everything's been closed off. You can't get anywhere. We used to have one of the best four-wheel drive trails in this part of the country used to be up into Carlton Lake. And they put so many restrictions on that property, you couldn't go in there because it was erosion problems. You couldn't go in there because it was elk winter range. You couldn't go in there because it was elk cabin range. You couldn't go in there because it was close to the wilderness. And now they want to put a lousy ski area up there. If it was too sensitive an area at the time to be recreational opportunity for 2 or 3 months out of the year to four-wheel drive people, it should be too sensitive an area to have a ski area in. But, we have had over the years a tremendous amount of four-wheel drive activity in this part of the country. Not necessarily four-wheelers as we know them at now, but motorized, in the backcountry, and now there's really nothing left. They talk about the private sector closing it off, and granted, you go up behind Paws Up, there's a lot of public ground behind them, but you can't get to it because they own the access. And it's all gated and locked. And, Plum Creek's that way, but the Forest Service is worse than anybody, in my opinion.
So your concern is that under National Forest Management, there would be more loss of public access? Okay, that's one of the ownership possibilities. One of the things I wanted to say to the group is in this next session, there's no right or wrong comments. You're going to hear some people may say something you may or may not agree with, and we're not trying to reach any agreement tonight as much as get a big picture view, a sort of collective sense of how you feel about the way they should proceed as they work on this project. So I wanted to come back to you because you said something early on, and I want to make sure we capture that without putting words in your mouth.
Well, the statement was made if, for instance, in the area in the Swan Valley where there's a lot of state land and it's checkerboard, if the state acquired all of it, then the roads could be contiguous or, it would be more efficient for, I assume, harvesting timber to make money for the schools. And that's not going to be good for grizzly bears. And Fish Creek is the area where there are a lot of wolves. And same thing. And Plum Creek certainly hasn't set a good example for managing fisheries. Their signs say they do, but they log right down to the rivers. They only take a certain number of board feet along the rivers, but they take trees right from the rivers. So I'm not impressed with following their example. And I'm also really concerned about the little tiny bit of old growth timber that we have because it's vital to animals like fishers and pileated woodpeckers and flammulated owls and all those kind of things that we just don't have much of. And those are the most valuable things we have in Montana because they're the rarest.
Thank you. Who else has something to say about this? Do you have any comments about specific pieces of ground in the area where you live, some things you would like them to know about a particular area that they'll be managing in the short term before it's turned over to different ownership?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm a slow thinker. I've just been trying to reflect on what Kathy was saying about grizzlies and wolves and wildlife protection. And I guess I was wondering, as you proceed in making the lands available to either agencies or private sectors, are there prioritizations that you would establish in those transactions that would be in place so that so that the concerns like Kathy brings up and like Mike brings up, are there going to be areas designated within an overall kind of a travel plan or a wildlife management plan that's consistent for the whole area as it's going through transactions? That would be a priority that the communities would be comfortable with. And I think that would be, giving opportunities for different forms of recreation and preserving wildlife habitat. It would seem like in that large of a transactional area, it would be possible to establish some priorities and to make those, prime considerations in all the transactions so that it would survive as an intact entity in those kinds of areas and establish that as a bigger block of land.
So, let me see if I understand that correctly. Because we have an opportunity here in terms of this acquisition, are you saying you would like to see us participate in the development of an integrated or overall management plan, including access, travel management, et cetera, with adjacent property owners?
Well, I think work with the communities as you are doing to establish the community's priorities in those areas, what they would like to see, and to whatever extent it's possible as the transactions proceed to put those things in place. For example, if there were an area that was accessible for four-wheel vehicles that was appropriate, kind of give that some position in the negotiations for the sale. And same with grizzly habitat. That is, can the project establish priorities that are honored in the transactions that as if they were part of an easement or part of a practice that would be ongoing?
So that's a question.
Right. I think that, we will, any transaction is going to be a negotiated transaction most likely. And it certainly is our objective to achieve, all the project goals as we reconvey properties. And that's what we'll strive to do. But in terms of the ranking and the weighting of things, if we have an area that's highly, has high resource values for fisheries, then that's what we're going to try to conserve, and that may or may not come at the expense of a timber harvesting prescription, or it may alter that or influence what type of a prescription might be applied there, or access considerations. I guess I can't, predict a variety of scenarios, but I think I understand your question, and yes, we will, in any of our transactions, we will try to negotiate to achieve our project goals. And maybe we need to have a structure by which we make sure that we go through a laundry list as we evaluate each parcel in terms of its conveyance. I don't know.
So do you see some opportunities here as this land transitions from Plum Creek ownership into some other ownership? Are there some opportunities you'd like them to try and take advantage of?
Well, I think the Bonner, Clinton, Potomac communities really rely on a lot of timber industry products and logging and the mill. We're certainly hopeful that somebody will come into the mill and purchase it as a mill and get some jobs back into the community. And I just hope that there is careful, consideration, and, if they do become state lands and, there will be logging and that's part of what they do. And that, this is, if you look at this, that whole area straight east of Clinton is where the 124 fire was. So imagine a huge part of that is land that's already been burnt. And hopefully there'll be some good management of thinning and building healthy forests, building, healthy forests so we don't have the continuous fires in the areas, and utilizing some of the resources, but preserving as much as we can the integrity of the forest and the wildlife and recreation use. I think that we need to work together and try and compromise on being able to get the best that we can out of the forests.
What was that fire, 124?
124.
Mile marker.
What's that?
That was a mile marker number.
Oh, okay.
That was the only way they could identify it.
Isn't that a lot of that?
Looked like it.
I definitely appreciate the concern, or what was said about if there's one land manager, it's easier to, for example, manage a watershed or a drainage. But to go back to this sort of sense of prioritization, it seems like when push comes to shove and you've got different entities vying for these properties, I'm not 100% confident that you'll actually be able to do that and have that land sort of blocked out so that you can institute some sort of, drainage level or watershed level, restoration in the case, depending on the level of degradation of the land. So maybe a suggestion would be to evaluate the lands based on the waterways and the watersheds and try to, if there's a very, if there's an entire creek system that you can see is, pretty torn up from top to bottom, maybe that's an area where the lands along there can be sort of clumped, or you can try to prioritize in some way restoration or management plan that looks at that as a whole. The idea, I can't buy the idea that, either state or federal or private is going to really, in effect, take all the land in one chunk and then implement all of the, achieve all the goals that you're setting. I don't see how, the idea and the reality may be a little disconnected. So that's just a suggestion to look at that at the level of, and maybe it's forest corridors and not water, but in some sort of natural aspect.
You asked what was left in the way of timber on some of those areas, and I'm familiar with the areas on either side of the interstate between Tura and Clinton. And Plum Creek's been into those twice in the last 10 years. And the first time they took everything, I thought, and the second time, it seems to me they took everything down to 6 inches DBH. That can't be possible, can it? But anyway, it's pretty ravaged.
What area was that?
From Missoula going east as far as Clinton on either side of the interstate. That's just what I'm familiar with, but I know that was Plum Creek's policy.
Almost to Rock Creek on that.
Yeah, and I know other areas that aren't in your grid there, for acquisition, like up Gold Creek, they've just done the same thing, everything but the one piece of state land has been wiped out. Anything that wasn't already taken by a fire, and then it was dried out by being cut over, so it burned even better.
I guess I'm kind of on board with Kathy on some of this. I think Plum Creek land management is an oxymoron. And I've seen some of their land management, and in places it's absolutely appalling. And I'd just like to propose for the record here that historic use of a piece of land is not necessarily the best use for a piece of land, and I hope that's something that you take into consideration in your planning for the future, whether it's for four-wheelers or whether it's for Chuck and I on horseback, or people who just like to head out on a mountain trail for the peace and solitude that they can find on foot, which I enjoy also. Historic use in many places has not been very good use of the land, and I'd like to see some alteration in that too. And historic use in many places has been abuse, not use.
Some of what we're getting into too is our population's getting older, and people are wanting to be able to use the forest, not so much as walking as, a lot of people still hike, and a lot of people walk, but we are getting a lot of older people. Myself, I don't like to walk much anymore, I can't, but a lot of this country that's like from Milltown down, all of these pieces here with Plum Creek and Forest Service, this area's been logged pretty heavy all along the freeway. There's not a lot of merchantable timber left in there. And Clearback, you can get way back in there and look way down into Rock Creek from some of that, and it's been logged over, and Plum Creek did a relog in the last couple of years. And once, when you go into relog, there's not a lot left. Merchantable stuff is stuff that wasn't merchantable the last time you went through. But there is probably a lot of places in there that are blocks that haven't been, relogged yet, but a lot of the stuff really needs to be managed better, because when you get into some that's so thick, most of the logs are rot to some extent. They can't grow enough, so they rot. And it's amazing some of what you see cut down and in decks that are, a lot of it's not merchantable anymore because it stood too long. It's dead and dying from the inside out.
It was mentioned at the meeting you had at the county courthouse early on in this endeavor that you would have a program to make sure that sustainable forestry practices were adhered to. Currently, Plum Creek has a industry-based program, which I believe is a complete joke. So I'd hope that you prepare to have some teeth to back up what you envision is sustainable and what the community feels is. Some of those lands, has been mentioned, are so hammered already that good luck there. You're taking on a lot of junk, so I'd really get some feet on the ground and check out some of this stuff. Gold Creek was mentioned, you're not purchasing that, but that's pretty hammered. Mill Creek's pretty bad out of Frenchtown. So please make sure that that sustainable forest program has teeth and is implemented and adhered to. And on that note, what is your protection for the obligation of fiber commitment that you're making in Plum Creek? If we have some devastating fire event that takes out a big chunk of this land, are we going to be on the hook? Are you going to be on the hook for making that obligation of board feet that you've committed to, which is a pretty high number? Those are a couple of my concerns, something to look forward to. And again, I'm just a little, it is mentioned in the newspaper, we're buying this land twice, it appears. I don't completely able to wrap my head around that, but it appears that we're preparing to pay a very high market value for lands that are of questionable market value. And and I'll reiterate what I heard some of the other county commissioners saying. Missoula's getting a chunk of this. We had Mineral County there. We had Bitterroot, River Valley County asking, where's ours? So how did this, you come out with maps and we're at public meetings, but it seems a little cart before the horse. And so maybe you're backing up, maybe you're taking all this input in, but it just seems to be this big thing with Missoula, and that affects how zoning goes into play and whether Plum Creek has the ability to protest any zoning laws that the county commissioners are very actively trying to pursue in this county. So a couple issues and some things that, I would hope would come to light in that regard. And then mentioning about his usage and stuff, I think the Forest Service does a poor job around here providing off-road vehicle usage and specifically a park maybe. So that could be something that could be implemented. Give these guys a place to go tear around and get their horsepower kicks. And we won't have to maybe close as many roads and stuff in the future because there won't be as much damage or conflict and such. So a few things I've been thinking about.
So there were some questions in there, and do you want to answer a couple of them?
I'll try if I can remember them all. There was
We can help you.
quite a bit there. In terms of the fiber supply agreement and situations that could affect our ability to provide the designated amount of timber to Plum Creek, fire is one of the caveats. There's a clause in that agreement. If there's a fire that affects the areas anticipated to be utilized for meeting the fiber supply agreement, then that changes the requirements that we'd be under, depending upon severity of the fire, extent, et cetera. So, yes, that is addressed, and we have whatever you want to call it, an escape clause or whatever, an ability to adjust the fiber supply agreement based upon, occurrences like that.
I want to add that there's also a clause in there for there's an economic clause in there as well. If we're not able to manage these lands and meet the fiber supply agreements given the market, then that we will have to renegotiate those amounts. It goes off for I think a year, and then you wait and see if the market comes back. So there are not only natural hazards, but there's also economic hazards where we're not going to have to go in and do something that we just can't live up to economically. So.
Another question was sustainable forestry
Right.
practices.
Yes, currently Plum Creek does meet the Sustainable Forest Initiative third-party certification, and that's that is an industry standard, and people have questioned the validity of that, and I can't speak to that directly. I know that in our initial analysis, we have said we would, at a minimum, meet that certification, and we would try to achieve the FSC, which is a higher standard of certification, the Forest Stewardship Council, I believe it is, certification. We have, as quote, conservation organizations, and in particular the Nature Conservancy, in terms of its mission for conserving biodiversity and other fish and wildlife habitats and plant habitats, we had concerns that whether or not we could meet, fiber supply objectives given the condition of these lands, and that's why we did a preliminary assessment. And we were comfortable that we can meet the terms of that fiber supply agreement without adversely affecting all the resource values that we're trying to protect here in the long term. So that's about all I can say. I haven't been on the ground in all of this part, and I'm not a silviculturist, so I can't speak to any details in that regard, but we are retaining that expertise. If we don't have it in-house, we will be retaining that expertise to assist us in our management planning.
No, I'm not sure I got this right. Another sort of comment was on the fact that a large proportion of these lands fall in Missoula County, and that would have some effect on zoning.
It could have an effect. We are acquiring private lands held by Plum Creek. Some of those lands may be conveyed into public ownership, but basically it will change the pattern of ownership and the amount of acres that are owned by public or private entities, which are factors that are established in the zoning authorities that allows for protest based on, X amount of protest of private land within a county proposed zoning area. So it will affect those calculations, but we can't say how at this point in time because we don't know what the ultimate dispositions will be. But we can say that it will, those calculations will have to be redone based upon, the outcome. But
Well, the reason I mention that is because it was commented, I made the comment that other western Montana counties are being left out in a large part of this. And this is federal money coming in, so it appears there's a tie-in there somehow that's not being discussed. And why is it Missoula gets so much and Mineral and River Valley County get nothing? Is this not federal money, and are you not a Montana state organization?
it's not federal money, number one. We're hoping to achieve about half of the project funding through that federal mechanism that I mentioned. So,
Half of it's federal.
and what we anticipate is that probably a third of the acreage might go federal, about a third to the state, about a third retained in our ownership until we can figure out a logical private or other disposition. In terms of the overall footprint and why some counties are included or not included, thanks, Chris. As stated earlier, this stemmed from our involvement in the Swan Valley and the Blackfoot Valley and our relationships with Plum Creek and the opportunity to work with a single landowner to achieve some large-scale conservation outcomes, and as well as the addressing this ownership pattern. It's a remnant of the old railroad grants, largely. The negotiations I wasn't directly involved with, but I can say that negotiations were back and forth and extensive. You notice there are no lands up here, no Plum Creek lands up here that are included in our project. It's not because we didn't try. We tried to build on that Thompson Fisher easement and worked with agencies to try to identify what are other conservation priorities in that part of the country. Basically, through the willing seller, willing buyer negotiation process, we were not able to secure any of those lands as part of this agreement. This is what we were able to come to agreement in terms of an acquisition. The Ravalli County line is here. Whether or not, these few acres in Ravalli County were excluded or included based on county ownership, I don't believe that's correct. I think it was more relative to what Plum Creek's ownership interests were. The lower part of the Lolo here, these areas around west of Missoula here. Those basically were not available for the acquisition project through whatever, negotiations occurred. So this is what we were able to negotiate, and it just happens that it affects 5 counties, a little bit in Powell, the majority in Missoula, a little bit in, or a significant amount in Mineral and Lake counties.
What I heard about Mineral County is that so much of it is already federal lands that the folks in Mineral County didn't want more of the lands turned into federal lands. And then my understanding about the Flathead area, they have active mills up there. And so they want to keep their lands that are close to the mills so that they can continue to log on them. And that's what I had heard, why they weren't included in the lands for sale.
They're doing away with the timberland that they have that's farthest away from their mills. Basically, the stuff that's been logged and relogged. Looks like anyway from what's offered.
In the land that has trees on it.
So some other comments on this?
Well, I'm thinking, Marcia, what you said earlier about opportunities, and there is kind of a special opportunity in our community, and it's right here. This is the Milltown Superfund site here. And this is northwestern land, and these are areas that are adjacent to the land that we believe has a very good chance of becoming a state park. So it may be beneficial to everyone concerned for you guys to come to a redevelopment working group meeting sometime and just, because I personally have no clue, or I have some ideas, but I don't know what would go best as a buffer in this area for wildlife and if this park develops, this area would be naturally restored and incorporate corridors and habitat. What would be the best use of this land that would be consistent with that state park if it comes about, and we believe that it probably will.
Can I ask a question, follow-up question? Yes, we're certainly aware of the reclamation going on there. What is the status of that dialogue, and is it at the director's level with the state parks people, or?
Well, the status right now is that there's been a design proposed for the site that we hope will become a state park. And we're in the process of forming a group to raise funds to provide the funding for the operation of a state park there. Right now, the agencies we have been in touch with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and with other state agencies, but you can't have a park unless you have some money. And so they've been telling us, well, we'd love to do the park, but it's going to take some funding. And so right now there's an effort to provide a basis for the funding that would enable that park to occur. Okay. But the agency, the working group and the commissioners are in touch with State Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and talking about how this park could happen. The Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has given us some cost numbers about what it would take to operate the park and to maintain it and to put in the facilities that are needed. And so we have those kinds of numbers, and all we have to do is find out how to get the funding to do that.
But it's presently not included in the resource damage?
No.
Okay.
The state has also indicated they're very, very interested in ownership of that land as it becomes a state park. So.
Okay. Make sure that we have your contact information so we can follow up on this.
Just dawned on me, we should be talking about that. Well, this is the first I think we realized that it was right there.
Well, this kind of takes us to this next question, and we don't have to stick just to this question, but one of the things we want to make sure we get down is what do you need to stay connected as the Montana Legacy Project goes forward? And part of this is who are the groups, what's the media that works for you, but I want to capture, so what's the group that you think they need to stay wired in with?
It's the
Redevelopment?
Well, it's just called the Milltown Working Group would be the short version of it. It's the Milltown Superfund Site Redevelopment Working Group.
I'll sell for Milltown Working Group. Is that enough for you?
Got it.
Okay, but that's the entity that will know about the development of this park, or they can interface with to look at opportunities that may come about as a result of this. Okay. Okay. So what are some other, maybe some people that aren't here tonight, are there some other organizations that Chris might follow up with to make him aware of this effort?
There is a community council out here.
Is the Bonner Community Council?
The Bonner Milltown Community Council, certainly is.
Okay.
All that information should be available through the county commissioners, and probably the rural initiatives should have all of our contact information as well.
Okay.
How about the Hellgate Hunters and Anglers?
Hellgate Hunters and Anglers?
Yeah.
Are you a member of the community council?
Is there a local snowmobile club or ATV club? Anybody know?
Pardon, local what?
Local snowmobile or ATV club? Is there one, I'm asking?
It's gotta be one Sealy.
There's the Blue Ridge.
Right. I
I think Montana Snowgoers or something like that, but my brother was the president of the club.
What's the name of your brother? Did you say your brother? What's his name?
Jim.
Jim. We won't
I'll give him a
say
call.
Okay, so let me ask you, how did you learn about this meeting tonight? Website?
Of the, it wasn't either of your two, it was the Legacy Project website.
The Legacy, so you just went onto their website and that's how you found out about the meeting. How about some other people?
Mailings from King
Okay, so mailings, Friends of Two River mailings. How else do people stay?
We heard about through the community council meeting last night.
Okay.
Lumberjack logs, school paper.
School paper.
I found out from Blackfoot Challenge.
You on a mailing list
No, I happened to be at
at a
Bay
meeting?
Gray and saw the director.
Okay. So sort of those are one-on-one, okay. Are there anything else?
I thought Cloud Unlimited.
What about media? Are there any radio stations or TV stations or newspaper? Are there any things is there a weekly newspaper?
Tim's wife has an excellent email
Oh, okay,
accumulation,
okay.
and she contacts
Can we
a
put this up here?
tremendous amount of people.
Sue's
So we'll call Jim and Sue.
Put up in the phone book under Tim's wife.
Sue's mailing list, okay.
Sue Fury, Fury.
Okay,
An awful lot of people get her emails, and I think
okay, but that's
rely on that.
great.
that source of-
And a lot of times it's these informal networks that work better than the formal ones. Okay. What's that?
Graffiti on the wall.
Graffiti on the wall at the schoolyard. Well, what else? We don't have to go till 9. If we're done here.
I have just a little question. What I'm understanding is you're kind of putting yourself in a temporary stewardship of these lands and whatnot, and for them to go on to further people, and you're talking about conservation easements on those. Those conservation easements, are they long-term? I mean, if the person that buys this buys it with a conservation easement, and down the road he sells it, do they have to, I just need a little clarification for my own little round head on that.
Yes,
Just a little question.
conservation easements are very individual in terms of, again, it's a property right or property rights that are being conveyed or reserved, and so they are negotiated with each individual landowner. If we own the land, then we negotiate with the potential buyer who has, maybe the buyer has an ability to benefit from a tax standpoint if they place the easement on the property. We as a private nonprofit, we don't have that benefit capacity if we place the easement on it first. But if our ownership is underwritten by entities that have conservation purposes as their mission, that may allow us to place restrictions on the property before we convey it as well. So it's really hard, it's going to be case by case, working with, who those entities might be, if it's a Stimson or a Stoltz or somebody like that. Basically, we'll be negotiating with them cooperatively to figure out the best way to convey the property, come to an agreement on terms of value and terms of usage or restrictions.
I was wondering, on the private land that you're selling, is there a limit as to how large or how small of parcels you'll be selling? Is there any guidelines on that? Will you sell them as small as an acre parcels, or do they have to be 100,000 parcels or sections, or?
We're definitely trying to avoid the small acreages on this project. Our hope is that we can sell it in larger blocks. But at this point, we haven't developed any specific guidelines on that, but I know that the goal of the project is to.
But you could sell it to a smaller chunk that maybe someone would subdivide and.
No, we would, if we sell it in any, whatever the size, again, the goal of the project would be to restrict development and to keep public access open. And so it's not our goal to sell it in a 5-acre to someone who may then turn around and develop a subdivision.
But if you're selling it to a private individual, you can't restrict them.
You can with a conservation easement.
Well, that's what I was wondering, if we were on the same.
And that raises one point that we haven't made tonight, but it has come up in our work in the Swan Valley, and that is that we're acquiring a lot of acreage here. There may be some parcels that are logical for other community needs. We don't know that every one of these parcels has significant resource values for fisheries or wildlife or public recreation or timber productivity. But some of these parcels, particularly those adjacent to communities, maybe they have some value for community development, whether that's affordable housing opportunities, whether that's for a solid waste transfer station or something of that nature. In the Swan Valley, the folks in Condon have given indication that because there's so much federal ownership, they would like to, participate and look at some of these parcels as opportunities for community development. And in those situations, we'll have to work again on a case-by-case basis, but maybe it's logical that it be conveyed to the county for public facilities, or maybe it's logical that we work in partnership with a developer to actually develop affordable housing or something of that nature. So that's another thing I would encourage people to think about in terms of your locale here, is whether or not there are opportunities along those lines. And again, we would work with the county and the county planning agencies and the local growth policies to make sure that things conformed. We don't want to sell a piece of ground for private development out in the middle of nowhere. That would defeat a lot of the purposes of our project. But there might be some parcels that are within growth areas that are logical for that purpose, or portions of parcels that don't have the conservation values. Maybe part of the parcel does have a stream running through it that needs to be protected, but another part is high and dry and has good access. Those are the kinds of things we'd like to know too.
And just to clarify, you mentioned earlier at another meeting, you have to charge full market value. There's no sweetheart deals on land. You can't sell off any parcel of land below market value.
Well, there's no sweetheart deals.
Well, that would
from
be
the
below market value. That's what I'm saying. You can't do that.
Well, I think before when we said sweetheart deals, we were talking about, people that have potentially a conflict of interest or things like that.
Somebody within your own organization.
Right.
Are eligible to buy this land, but have to pay full market value.
I'm just saying that we are not engaged in any dialogue about sweetheart deals. Now, the valuation, we anticipate that, every conveyance will be pretty much at fair market value, but because portions of our funding stream are through philanthropic organizations, that may allow us to, for example, give a break to a state entity or something like that whereby we can convey at something other than fair market value. But generally, that's right. We should just consider all these transactions to be conducted at fair market value.
And you have no way to guarantee public access to these lands in perpetuity? There's no way to clause public access?
Well, we will work to achieve that in terms of any private conveyances. And as we mentioned earlier in the meeting, public conveyances, likely cannot be encumbered in that regard. They would be subject to the travel management aspects of whatever agency acquires them, whatever public agency may acquire them.
Okay.
Well, I came a little late. Is this ground still scheduled to be a part of Phase 1? Because I know some of the meetings previously, the schedule wasn't quite clear yet. So is this area still in Phase 1? Or partial area?
I guess I don't know that. Do you know that, Chris?
Well, I think a good part, as I understand it, a good part of the Potomac between 200 and 90 may very well be in Phase 1. But again, I'm not sure of that either yet.
Okay.
So.
I can't remember who was commenting before about the land, I guess it was Kathy's question I was relating this to. And I think part of what Gary was asking earlier is about that piece of land kind of south of the Superfund site area has been an area of concern to us because having been involved with the project for numerous years, there have been times that people have made conjecture about how great it would be to have their big, lovely home up on that piece of land. And they could personally enjoy the benefits of having that park at their feet. And that's something we hope to avoid, and so that is a piece of land that we do have concern about. And I think there's probably concern about other areas that are contiguous with this community also. I know somebody else had mentioned out, and I don't know if this is on the map or not, just across the river from the Stimson Mill and slightly up the Blackfoot. I don't know if that's on it or not, but there's concern about that being developed and subdivided also, so.
So you're saying those are two areas where you would not want to see development?
And the second one was cross the river from Stimson Mill up the block.
And upstream, yeah, there is land there that looks developable, but gee, it'd be terrible if it was. Anyway. John.
The other thing is there's a spot right behind the school that looks like that this is the part there, and the school uses it an awful lot. The school B is up there, and I think it's a real important historical spot for the school to maintain that, to be able to maintain access for that. The school kids really use it a lot.
They use it for classes?
Yeah.
They do a lot of field
Scientific
trips.
special field
Science.
trips.
Science.
And it would be horrible to have that restricted off to them for any reason.
Is there a name for that?
The bee,
The Bee Hill. I don't
The
know.
what? The
Bonner Mountain.
The Bonner
I
Bee.
don't know. what
The
it's
Bee
called,
Hill?
but it's-
the letter B.
The
Oh,
letter
okay.
B is on
Okay.
there.
Okay. And that's
it's-
in the
right
mon,
behind the school, and it looks like that's that teeny tiny little red piece there.
And who is the principal? Or is that the
Doug Ardiana.
Doug Ardiana?
or Diana? D-I-A-N-A? Okay, all right. Anything else?
See, that yellow part there used to be BLM land. And then that was traded for some land, I think, up on the Blackfoot with Plum Creek and, I don't know if it was Forest Service or whatever. And that's been heavily logged. And now that's been privately purchased, and they're talking about putting homes up on top of Bonner Mountain.
It's amazing how many places you get, and you get way back into the pucker brush, and here's somebody's house. And you look across the canyon, and what, there's another house over there, and you're
So if you go to private land.
It's
and
amazing.
Even,
Superior and
100
Plains and Paradise areas are pretty bad for that.
And then they want fire protection too.
You want to say anything
Then they want the roads plowed in the winter.
There's confusion.
So the private land would be a pretty good
Yeah, and I think maybe we should just reemphasize, the project objectives in terms of maintaining forest lands, restricting subdivision and development in, inappropriate areas, providing for protection of natural resource values. If we enter into any dialogue with a private party, those are going to be our guiding principles. And we don't want to, unless it's appropriate, given the land, given the local government perspective, et cetera, we don't want to encourage development in rural landscapes that are inappropriate and very costly to serve, provide additional risk for fire protection, that sort of thing. That's what we're trying to avoid. We've seen some of that happen on some of the Plum Creek lands and other private lands. And so we're looking at this as an opportunity to kind of head that off and steer more appropriate land ownership patterns and management issues, on these affected lands.
Well, you about done? Okay.
Motion to adjourn?
Somebody did
Let me
mention
say,
the website, and
Right, one thing, I want Chris to just tell you future plans for
Right, yeah.
involving you.
We're going to, as we stated at the beginning of this meeting, this is going to be a long, multi-year project, and we want to engage a community here and in other places as well. So we have a list here of ideas that we should be talking to, and we will do that and follow up with I think you in terms of the Bonner Community Council, it sounds like, and other groups. But as we move on, just any ideas you have of groups or places where you think we need to talk about this project, all you need to do is contact us and we can set up a meeting. If there is some sort of a concern that is building up in your community, we're going to need to rely on you to tell us that, if we don't know about it, we can't talk about it. But I think that communication is really important, so the more we can talk, the better. So hopefully we can keep this going and develop, as we go on, develop these perhaps regular meetings. If we need to do that, we can just kind of tailor it to your community and your concerns.
A lot nicer to speak in fact than rumor.
Right.
Well, and it works on the other end too. If we know what's going on, then the community can voice their concerns.
Mm-hmm.
They aren't going to necessarily be able to voice a concern if they don't know what's happening until after the fact, and after the fact it's always harder to.
Right. And that's one of the things we've done is gone out to these communities when frankly we don't know what some of the dispositions are yet, and we don't know what some of the answers are yet, or exactly where the funding is going to come from. But one thing we do need to do is get out and talk to people who know this ground really well and hear your concerns or hear your opportunities or hear how certain pieces of these lands are used, so we don't just assume something and make an incorrect decision. So one of the ways we can keep in contact is we're going to be updating our website as more information comes out. We'll be putting that information out. That's themontanalegacyproject.org.
Montana written out.
The Montana Legacy Project, yep.
And that should be on that sheet.
It is on the, yeah,
That you could,
thanks.
either if you didn't pick it up when you came in, you can grab one on your way out.
Yeah, on that one-page sheet that has my phone number and email address and the project website on that as well. And so I encourage you to direct any questions you hear just to us or let us know when and if we need to have a discussion if we haven't already made that plan. Okay.
And we meet once a month on Mondays, second Monday of every month.
So thank you so much for coming.
And I'll ask for them to put you guys' name on.
yes, really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very informative.
It's good to have information out.
it's the 19th?
Because we'll probably cancel December, because that's right during spring break, so
Yeah.
we can't cancel November.
Well, we either cancel it, I mean, sometimes we've only canceled it once. Usually we move that one too, depends on what kind of business we have. But I just need you to be thinking about that so I can get.
Wednesday the 19th. Can't we just make
Yeah.
a decision now?
Yeah, I'd
Okay,
say
good.
let's not cancel it, at least that's my opinion, because we'll have things to talk about.
Yeah.
But go to the 19th and keep the ship going, and,
Okay, I'm done.
Okay, we're adjourned.
thank you, Scott.
Now you can say anything you want.
Well, it is the federal government and the state government that sponsored our Fossil Back yellow buses, and I think will trademark.
You have really nice buses over there, by the way.
They are, they're sweet, yeah.
Much prettier than our Missoula buses.
Well, that's because we're starting out, Missoula's had one a long time, but the bus lines, and then will we get development along the bus lines? I think we will, I think some of that'll happen. I think the key, though, is to go out and say to people that are developing, they're either developing the communities that we're talking about, or they're developing this commercial, is to say, hey, you want a bus line here? It's going to require a subsidy, and that becomes part of our design, our overall design standard, our overall vision. Not whether or not you have a setback of 10 feet, but whether or not you're going to come along and participate in the public transportation. And I think you know, you control, as a city, you control growth to some extent by where you put in transportation, let's face it. If you were to build a new road to nowhere out in the middle of the valley, I guarantee you people would come along and develop along it. So, you know, the question is, what kind of transportation do you want, and where do you design it? And so we see what we're trying to do now is, are you going to put in a bus stop? Because of course you're going to put in a bus stop, but you're going to put in, but what you're going to do is you're going to help subsidize that bus route so that they'll come to you. So you got people coming by your door, they're coming by your retail, they're visiting, they have an easy way to get to the university, because we really have sort of a monolithic employer, you know, Bozeman, a town of 40,000 with Montana State University and the hospital and a couple other things, but really, you know, how are you going to ride that bus from where you live up to the university, and is it going to take you 15 minutes? And I think the more developers that get onto that bus, if you will, I think they'll be more successful, and it'll cause some of the density and the kind of things you were talking about without that onerous sort of totalitarian regulation that I object to as a free market kind of guy.
Thanks, Ed. We got a few minutes for questions, comments from the audience, if you have any. In the back.
Hi, I'm Annie Thompson from Lottie County Planning and Zoning. I have two questions. One, I was wondering if you could talk more about your affordable housing that you're doing in Bozeman and how you're making that work. And then I was wondering what you would say are the biggest things that you can do to improve downtown vitality.
Downtown what?
Vitality?
You got to have people live in downtown. I think that's the biggest thing. You must have, and some of that has to do with height. Some of that has to do with height, because, you know, they're not making any more of that downtown land right there. So, you know, you're going to have to build up. You're going to put retail on that first floor, and you're going to require retail on the first floor downtown. And then maybe the second and the third floor, or the second floor, you're going to have offices, maybe the third floor. And then above that, however many stories you're comfortable with going, I think we're comfortable as tall as the Baxter, as tall as the Bozeman, that's 6 or 7 stories. You're going to have condos, apartments. You're going to have people living down there. Having people down there is the big deal for keeping downtown vital. And being able to get to downtown. And yes, part of that's buses, but also being able to park and shop, because, you know, you can go out to Costco, they got plenty of parking, it's free. So, you know, we still are going to drive down there, but we can't take a bus, but living down there is a big deal. The affordable housing ordinance is pretty new. I think the 3 mills that we levy have to do with driving the supply side, which has to do with you know, training people to be able to qualify for credit, and also to subsidize that, to take a second mortgage. So we subsidize people's down payments as well. The ordinance itself does a couple of things. I think it's small houses, when it's a single family houses, and we're going to do them, it's aimed at workforce housing. So it's aimed at the person that makes, I'd say, $38,000 to $60,000 a year. And if you gasp a little bit at that, let me just tell you that, you know, if you're over in Idaho and some of the popular places there, they're talking about affordable housing for people that make $90,000 a year. So, you know, it's all relative, but yeah, somewhere 38 to 62,000 as a family. We're aimed at that. Small houses on very small lots. Recognizing, though, that you're still competing with Manhattan, and if they choose to, they, instead of buying that in town, they could still drive out to Manhattan and buy the bigger lot with the bigger house. So, you know, I don't know that it'll work yet, because we're in, you know, we have to recognize we're in the market. The second thing we did is we require 3/10 of an acre, as the Montana statute allows, for parkland, as a donation for parkland. And what we looked back and found was, in the old days, we used to build on 70% of the land. Now we build on 50% of the land. So taking about 20% of that land and building affordable housing on it, that's part of the solution for staying in town and having affordable housing in town. And so narrower streets, a little bit fewer amenities. No, we still have sidewalks, we still have curbs and gutters, but but tighter streets, and then building on some of that parkland, some of that what we previously thought was open space, recognizing that, that's a density question as well, and recognizing that we're never gonna keep up with our parkland requirements just out of development, and we're gonna have to go to that, but yes. And then, recognizing that if you're ever gonna have any affordable housing, someone's gotta build it, and so a builder has to make a profit, and figuring out a way within the ordinance that a builder can still make a profit building it. And will it work? I don't know, it's in its infancy, but it is inclusionary zoning. If you're putting in a new subdivision in Bozeman, you must build affordable housing as you go phase to phase. That you must have that affordable housing component mixed in with the rest of your neighborhood. And you can have as many as 3 affordable houses right on a lot, on a larger lot that's mixed in with the rest of the neighborhood. So it's got to be inclusionary, it's got to be inside the neighborhood, but it can be on some of the land that we would previously have asked for as parkland.
Thanks. Other questions?
Jonathan, just a quick follow-up on this affordability issue. I don't know what the people's image in their mind when they think affordable